I'm Elizabeth Anderson. I'm 34, and I run a small nonprofit that helps homeless women get back on their feet. Last Saturday, I walked into my sister's wedding at the Grandview Country Club and watched her publicly call me a poor loser who embarrasses the family 30 seconds before my billionaire husband walked through those doors. You see, what Victoria didn't know, what none of my family knew, was that 6 months ago, I'd quietly married Alexander Whitmore. Yes, that Alexander Whitmore, the tech mogul whose name is on hospital wings and university buildings across 3 states, the man Forbes just named one of the youngest billionaires in America, the same man who fell in love with me not despite my work with the homeless, but because of it. But let me back up, because this story starts long before that wedding day, in the cramped streets of Millfield Heights where I chose to build my life, and in the marble hallways of Rosewood Estates where Victoria built hers. My family never understood why I left my corporate job at Pembroke Financial to start Hope Harbor, my nonprofit in downtown Millfield. "You're throwing away a six-figure salary to play Mother Teresa," my mother, Patricia Anderson, had said, her voice dripping with that particular brand of disappointment I'd grown to know so well. "Victoria would never make such a foolish decision." Victoria. My older sister by 3 years, married to Dr. Richard Thornton, living in their pristine colonial and Rosewood estates with their 2 perfect children and their perfect BMW in the driveway. Victoria, who never missed an opportunity to remind me that while she was building wealth, I was playing with homeless people and wasting my education. For 2 years, I'd endured the family dinners where Victoria would sigh dramatically when asked about my work. "Oh, Elizabeth's still doing her little charity thing," she'd say, as if I were a child playing house. "We keep hoping she'll come to her senses and get a real job." A real job. As if the 200 women who'd found housing, job training, and hope through Hope Harbor didn't matter. As if the partnerships I'd built with major corporations for funding didn't require the same business skills I'd used at Pembroke. As if the 16-hour days I worked weren't real work because I chose purpose over profit. The irony was delicious, really. While Victoria was impressed by wealth and status, she'd completely missed the fact that I'd married into more wealth than she could imagine. Alexander and I had met at a fundraising gala for homeless services. He'd approached my booth, not knowing who I was, genuinely interested in the work. No fanfare, no name-dropping, just a man in a simple black suit asking thoughtful questions about housing programs and job placement success rates. We talked for hours. He'd written a check for $50,000 on the spot, but what struck me wasn't the money, it was his questions. He wanted to know about sustainable solutions, about dignity-centered approaches, about the women's stories. When he asked me to coffee the next day, I said yes because of his genuine curiosity, not his bank account. I didn't even know who he was until our third date when the restaurant manager nervously approached our table asking for a photo. "Mr. Whitmore, sir, would you mind? My wife is such a fan of your work with educational initiatives." Alexander had looked embarrassed. He said, "I'm sorry," he'd said to me later, "I was hoping to just be Alex for a while longer." That's when I knew I was falling for the right man. He wanted to be seen for who he was, not what he had, just like I did. We'd married quietly 6 months ago in a simple ceremony at Millfield Community Garden, surrounded by some of the women from Hope Harbor and Alexander's closest friends. No media, no family drama, just vows exchanged under string lights with people who knew our hearts. I'd kept my maiden name professionally, and Alexander had supported that completely. Elizabeth Anderson is the name that built Hope Harbor. Don't change a thing. My family didn't know because, frankly, I'd grown tired of their judgment. Every conversation became about money, status, and my poor life choices. I'd stopped sharing details about my personal life because they'd twisted everything into evidence of my failure to live up to my potential. Victoria's wedding invitation had arrived with a handwritten note. "Please try to dress appropriately. The Thorntons are hosting, and we want to make an impression. Maybe borrow something nice?" Borrow something nice. As if I couldn't afford decent clothes. As if my simple, elegant style meant I was struggling financially. The assumptions were exhausting. Alexander had been traveling for business that week, but had promised to fly back early to escort me to the wedding. "It's time they met me anyway," he'd said, kissing my forehead. "I'm tired of watching them underestimate the most incredible woman I know." But his flight was delayed. So I arrived alone, wearing a beautiful navy dress, one that cost more than Victoria's monthly car payment, though she'd never know that, and watched my family's eyes narrow as they processed my arrival. "Oh, good. Elizabeth made it," Victoria had announced to her bridesmaids, her voice carrying that familiar edge. "And look, she found something appropriate to wear. Must have been a stretch on the nonprofit salary." The laughter that followed felt like ice in my veins. But I smiled, hugged my sister, and took my seat at table 12, the table farthest from the family section, next to the kitchen door, where the staff wouldn't be distracted by having to serve the family embarrassment. What they didn't know was that my phone was buzzing with texts from Alexander. "Landing now. Traffic from Millfield Airport to Grandview is terrible, but I'll be there soon. Can't wait to see their faces, Mrs. Whitmore." Mrs. Whitmore. He only called me that when he was feeling particularly mischievous. The morning of Victoria's wedding started with a phone call that should have been my first warning. I was in my apartment in downtown Millfield, the converted loft above Hope Harbor's main office, when my mother's voice cut through the speaker like a blade. "Elizabeth, you're not planning to mention your work today, are you?" Patricia Anderson's tone carried that familiar mix of exhaustion and embarrassment that I'd grown to associate with any conversation about my career choices. "Good morning to you too, Mom," I replied, balancing the phone between my shoulder and ear as I steamed the navy dress hanging on my closet door. The dress had cost more than most people's monthly rent, a beautiful piece from a boutique in Manhattan that Alexander had insisted on buying for me. And yes, if people ask what I do, I'll tell them I run a nonprofit. The silence stretched long enough that I thought she might have hung up. "Couldn't you just say you work in social services or community outreach? Something that sounds more professional?" There it was, the shame, the way my family had perfected the art of making my life's work sound like a hobby I'd eventually outgrow. "Mom, I employed 12 people full-time and have helped over 200 women rebuild their lives. Hope Harbor just received a recognition award from the governor's office for innovative housing solutions. I think that qualifies as professional." "Well, yes, but the Thorntons don't need to know all those details. Dr. Thornton's father owns half the medical practices in Westbridge County, Elizabeth. We just want to make sure you don't stand out for the wrong reasons." Stand out for the wrong reasons. Like caring about people was somehow shameful? "I'll be myself, Mom. Just like always." Another pause. "And Elizabeth, please don't bring up any of your stories about the women you help. People are trying to enjoy themselves." My stories? As if the triumphs and transformations I witnessed daily were dinner party anecdotes instead of real human experiences that mattered. After hanging up, I stood in front of my mirror and looked at the woman staring back. Shoulder-length auburn hair that I'd learned to style myself because spending $200 at salons felt wrong when that money could provide a week of meals for a family. Green eyes that had seen more real struggle and genuine joy than most people experience in a lifetime. Hands that had helped carry furniture into first apartments, had held babies while their mothers signed lease agreements, had written grant proposals at 2 a.m. because the work was too important to wait. I looked successful. I felt successful. But somehow, in my family's eyes, I was the cautionary tale. My phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. "Flight delayed another hour. I'm so sorry, love. Go ahead without me, and I'll meet you there. Can't wait to see you shine today." Shine. That's what he always said. Not behave, or try to fit in, or don't embarrass anyone. Just shine. The drive from Millfield to Rosewood Estates took 25 minutes, a journey that felt like traveling between two different worlds. My neighborhood, with its mix of renovated buildings and community gardens, where people knew each other's names and stories. Their neighborhood, where lawns were perfectly manicured and driveways were lined with luxury cars that never seemed to have a speck of dust. Grandview Country Club sat like a crown jewel at the end of Magnolia Drive, all white columns and sprawling terraces overlooking the golf course. Valet attendants in crisp uniforms directed a parade of Mercedes, BMWs, and Teslas into neat rows. I pulled up in my reliable Honda Civic, the same car I drove in for 5 years because it was paid off and reliable, and watched the valet's barely concealed surprise. "Welcome to Grandview, miss," he said politely, though his eyes were already scanning the line of cars behind me for something more impressive to park. Inside, the country club was everything I'd expected. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors polished to a mirror shine, and arrangements of white roses that probably cost more than most people's monthly groceries. Guests milled around in clusters, the women in designer dresses and the men in perfectly tailored suits, everyone looking like they'd stepped out of a catalog for How the Upper Class Relaxes. I spotted Victoria immediately. She was holding court near the grand staircase, resplendent in a pre-wedding cocktail dress that probably cost more than some people's cars, surrounded by her bridesmaids and what I assumed were the Thornton family members. Her laugh, the one she had perfected for social situations, carried across the room like wind chimes. "Elizabeth!" My Aunt Caroline appeared at my elbow, her smile warm but her eyes already scanning my outfit with the practiced assessment of someone who measured worth by price tags. "Don't you look nice? That's a lovely dress. Very understated." Understated. Code for not expensive enough. "Thank you, Aunt Caroline. You look beautiful too."
Have you met the Thorntons yet? Such accomplished people. Dr. Thornton's practice has offices in 3 counties now, and his wife just opened her second interior design studio. Very successful family. Very successful, unlike some people present. The subtext was clear. Before I could respond, Victoria's voice cut through the ambient chatter like a microphone being turned up. "Oh, there's my sister Elizabeth. Everyone, come meet the family activist." The way she said activist made it sound like a contagious disease. The group turned toward me with polite smiles and curious eyes. Victoria's future mother-in-law, a woman with silver hair and pearls that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, extended a manicured hand. "How lovely to meet you, dear. Victoria's told us so much about your volunteer work." Volunteer work, not career, not organization, not the fact that I'd built something from nothing and employed a dozen people in the process. "I run a nonprofit called Hope Harbor," I said, keeping my voice steady and professional. "We provide housing and job training for women transitioning out of homelessness." The slight pause, the exchanged glances, the way the conversation seemed to stumble for just a moment, it was all so predictably painful. "How charitable of you," Mrs. Thornton finally said, her smile never wavering, but her tone suggesting I'd just told her I collected bottle caps for fun. Victoria stepped smoothly into the silence. "Elizabeth has always been our little do-gooder. We keep hoping she'll find something more sustainable, but you know how it is with younger sisters. They have to find their own way." Find their own way? As if I were lost instead of exactly where I chose to be. "The work must be very challenging," Dr. Thornton Sr. chimed in, his voice carrying the particular tone people use when they're trying to be polite about something they find distasteful. "I imagine the people you work with have quite a few problems." Problems? Like being human was a problem, like needing help was a character flaw instead of a temporary circumstance. "Actually," I began, feeling the familiar fire that always rose when people dismissed the women I worked with, "the women who come to Hope Harbor are some of the strongest, most resilient people I've ever met. Last month, one of our graduates started her own catering business. Another just got accepted to nursing school. They don't have problems, they have potential." The group's polite smiles grew a little more strained. Victoria's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. See, I told you she was passionate about her little project. Elizabeth, why don't you go find your seat? I think they're about to start seating people for the ceremony. Her little project. 2 years of 80-hour weeks of grant writing and fundraising and policy advocacy reduced to a little project. But I smiled, hugged my sister, and made my way toward the seating chart posted on an ornate easel near the ceremony entrance. That's when I discovered exactly what my family thought of my place in their world. My name wasn't on the seating chart. Not Elizabeth Anderson, not Miss Anderson, not even +1. Just nothing. I stood there for a full minute, scanning the elegant calligraphy twice, 3 times, convinced I'd somehow missed it. But no. In a wedding with 150 guests, somehow the bride's only sister had been forgotten. "Excuse me," I said, to the young woman in a black dress standing nearby with a clipboard. "I'm Elizabeth Anderson, Victoria's sister. I don't see my name on the seating chart." Her face flushed pink as she flipped through her papers frantically. "Oh, yes, I have a note here. You're at table 15. I'm so sorry. There was a last-minute change and we haven't updated the display yet." Table 15? I'd been to enough weddings to know that table 15 might as well be in the parking lot. But what really struck me wasn't the seating assignment. It was the phrase last-minute change, as if my attendance had been an afterthought, a problem to be solved rather than a sister to be celebrated. This wasn't new, though. This pattern of making me feel like an inconvenience had been Victoria's specialty for years, long before I'd left Pembroke Financial to start Hope Harbor. It started in college, when I'd chosen State University over the private liberal arts school where Victoria had built her perfect resume. "Elizabeth always has to be different," she'd told our parents when I'd announced my decision. Never mind that State had the better social work program, or that I'd received a full academic scholarship. In Victoria's world, prestige mattered more than purpose, and my choice was seen as a deliberate rejection of family values. The pattern continued when I'd graduated summa cum laude and taken the job at Pembroke Financial. For 2 blessed years, I'd been the daughter who'd come to her senses. Victoria had loved introducing me then. "My sister Elizabeth, she works in corporate finance now, very successful." The approval in her voice had been intoxicating, even as the work itself slowly drained my soul. But even then, there had been signs. When I'd been promoted to senior analyst after just 18 months, a nearly unprecedented move at Pembroke, Victoria's congratulations came with a barb. "Well, I'm sure they needed to fill some diversity quota. Good timing for you." Never mind that my portfolio had outperformed every other analyst's in my department. Never mind that I brought in 3 major clients through innovative financial modeling that had impressed even the partners.
The real freeze had begun 2.5 years ago, when I'd announced I was leaving Pembroke to start Hope Harbor. The family dinner, where I'd shared my plans, had become legendary in our household. Not for the right reasons. "You're giving up a 6-figure salary to do what exactly?" my father, Robert Anderson, had asked, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "To start a nonprofit that helps homeless women transition to stable housing and employment," I'd explained, my voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. Victoria had actually laughed. "Elizabeth, that's not a career, that's a hobby. What happens when you get tired of playing savior?" "It's not playing anything," I'd replied. "There are over 2,000 homeless women in Millfield County alone. The existing services are fragmented and underfunded. I've identified gaps in the system that a targeted nonprofit could address." I'd presented my business plan because that's what it was, a business plan, complete with funding strategies, measurable outcomes, and sustainability models. I'd spent months researching, had already secured initial funding from 3 foundations, and had identified partnerships with local businesses for job training programs. But none of that mattered to my family. All they heard was that I was walking away from respectability. "Honey," my mother had said in that voice she used when she thought I was being particularly naive, "helping people is wonderful, but you have to think about your future. What about retirement? What about buying a house? What about, well, what about finding a husband? Men want partners who are financially stable. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me now. Standing in the Grandview Country Club with my secret billionaire husband's wedding ring hidden under my right-hand ring to avoid family questions. Victoria had been the most brutal, though. Elizabeth, I love that you want to help people. I really do. But you're throwing away everything you've worked for. You have an MBA from state, you're making great money, you have a future, and you want to give it all up to work with those people? Those people. The way she'd said it, like the women I wanted to help were somehow less deserving of dignity and opportunity. The months that followed had been a masterclass in family disappointment. Every conversation became about my poor decision-making. Every family gathering included at least one comment about when I'd come back to reality. When Hope Harbor celebrated its first year with a gala that raised $300,000, Victoria's response had been, "That's nice, dear, but when are you going to get a real job?" When Forbes had written an article about innovative nonprofits in the region and featured Hope Harbor prominently, my mother had called to say, "We saw the article, very nice, though I do hope all this publicity doesn't give you unrealistic expectations about what this little organization can become." Little organization. As if the 12 women I employed full-time, the partnerships I'd built with major corporations, and the 200 lives we'd transformed were somehow diminutive because they weren't generating profit for shareholders. The worst had been last Christmas. Victoria had hosted, as always, in her pristine Rosewood Estates home with its cathedral ceilings and professionally decorated tree. The Thornton family had been invited. Richard's parents, his sister and her hedge fund manager husband, even his cousin who worked for Goldman Sachs. The conversation had naturally turned to careers and achievements. Richard just made partner at the practice, Victoria had announced proudly, and his father is opening a 4th location next spring. Nods of approval all around. Success was easy to measure in their world. Money, expansion, recognition from peers who valued the same things. "And what about you, Elizabeth?" Mrs. Thornton had asked politely. "Victoria mentioned you work in social services." Before I could answer, Victoria had jumped in. "Elizabeth runs a little charity for homeless women. Very sweet of her, though we keep hoping she'll find something more substantial." Substantial. As if helping women escape cycles of poverty and abuse wasn't substantial. As if the job training programs that had placed dozens of women in full-time employment weren't substantial. As if the housing partnerships that had moved families from shelters to stability weren't substantial. "How many people work for you?" Richard's cousin had asked, clearly trying to be polite. 12 full-time employees, plus about 30 volunteers and several community partners. "And you support all those people through donations?" Dr. Thornton Sr. had asked, with the tone suggesting this was somehow unsustainable or unrealistic. "Through a combination of foundation grants, corporate partnerships, individual donations, and some government contracts. We're actually ahead of our sustainability projections for year 3. The polite nods that followed had been perfunctory at best. In their world, success was measured by how much wealth you accumulated, not how much impact you created. Victoria had sealed the evening with her traditional closing comment. "Well, Elizabeth has always been our idealist. We love her for it, even if we worry about her future." Our idealist, as if having principles was a phase I'd eventually outgrow. Standing now in the Grandview Country Club, looking at a seating chart that somehow forgot I existed, I realized that nothing had changed. I was still the family embarrassment, still the sister whose choices were tolerated rather than respected, still the woman whose life's work was seen as a quaint hobby rather than a legitimate career. But what they didn't know, what none of them had bothered to ask about, was that in the 2.5 years since I'd started Hope Harbor, I hadn't just built a successful nonprofit. I'd built a life of purpose, meaning, and yes, even love, that was richer than anything their narrow definition of success could measure. And in about 30 minutes, when Alexander walked through those doors, they were about to learn exactly how wrong they'd been about everything. Table 15 turned out to be everything I'd expected and worse. Tucked behind a marble pillar near the service entrance, it was clearly where they'd placed the problem guests. Elderly relatives who might need quick access to restrooms, plus ones who didn't really know anyone, and apparently, inconvenient sisters who'd chosen the wrong career path. My table mates were a fascinating collection of wedding afterthoughts. Great Uncle Harold, who'd driven down from Buffalo and kept checking his watch like he had somewhere better to be. A college roommate of Victoria's who seemed genuinely confused about why she'd been invited. And Richard's business partner's wife, who spent the entire pre-ceremony period complaining about the traffic from Westridge Heights. "I'm Elizabeth," I introduced myself as I took my seat, determined to make the best of the situation. "Oh," Great Uncle Harold perked up. "You're Victoria's sister. I haven't seen you since you were about 12. What do you do now?" Before I could answer, Victoria's college roommate, Jennifer, I gathered from her name card, leaned forward with interest. "Wait, you're the sister who works with homeless people, right? Victoria mentioned that. How fascinating! I've always wondered what that's like." There was genuine curiosity in her voice, such a stark contrast to the polite dismissal I'd grown accustomed to from my family, that I almost didn't know how to respond. "I run a nonprofit called Hope Harbor," I said, settling into the conversation. "We provide transitional housing and job training for women experiencing homelessness." "That must be incredibly rewarding work," Great Uncle Harold said, and I realized with a start that he meant it. "My late wife volunteered at a food bank for 20 years. She always said it was the most important thing she did." For the next 15 minutes, I found myself in the surreal situation of having a normal, respectful conversation about my work. Jennifer asked thoughtful questions about funding challenges and success rates. Harold shared stories about community service initiatives in Buffalo. Richard's business partner's wife, once she stopped complaining about traffic, revealed that her daughter was studying social work at Syracuse. It was a reminder of something I'd almost forgotten. Most people, when given actual information about what I did, found it interesting and valuable. It was only my family who seemed determined to see it as embarrassing. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the front of the room. Victoria had arrived in her full bridal glory, and the energy in the space shifted immediately. She was stunning, I had to admit. Her wedding dress was a masterpiece of lace and silk that probably cost more than most people's cars, and she wore it with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted she deserved the spotlight. The photographer was taking advantage of the golden hour lighting streaming through the country club's floor-to-ceiling windows, positioning Victoria for what would undoubtedly be magazine-worthy shots. The bridesmaids flanked her in coordinated poses, their dusty rose dresses creating a perfect backdrop for Victoria's ethereal white gown. I watched from my distant table as my mother fussed over Victoria's veil, adjusting and readjusting until it fell in perfect cascades. Patricia Anderson was in her element, the mother of the bride at an upscale wedding, surrounded by people who represented everything she valued: wealth, status, and social connections that mattered. That's when Victoria spotted me. Even from across the room, I could see her expression shift. The radiant bride smile flickered for just a moment as her gaze landed on table 15, taking in my presence like she had genuinely forgotten I was coming, which, given the seating chart situation, she probably had. She said something to the photographer, who nodded and stepped back. Then Victoria began making her way across the room, her dress flowing behind her like she was floating rather than walking. The conversations in her path quieted as guests turned to admire the bride's approach. When she reached my table, her smile was back in place, but I knew Victoria well enough to recognize the tension around her eyes. "Elizabeth," she said, her voice carrying that artificial brightness she used when she wanted to sound delighted but wasn't. "I'm so glad you could make it. How are you finding everything?" "It's beautiful, Victoria. You look absolutely stunning." "Thank you." She glanced around the table, taking in my table mates with barely concealed assessment. "We wanted to make sure you were comfortable. I know crowds can be overwhelming when you're not used to events like this. Events like this. As if I'd been living under a rock, not attending fundraising galas, corporate partnership meetings, and community events regularly through my work. As if I didn't know how to behave in upscale social situations. Actually, Jennifer chimed in unexpectedly, Elizabeth was just telling us about her nonprofit. It sounds amazing. You must be so proud to have a sister doing such important work.
The question hung in the air like a challenge. I watched Victoria's face carefully, curious how she'd respond when directly asked to express pride in my career. "Oh, yes," Victoria said, her tone carefully modulated. "Elizabeth has always been very passionate about helping people. It's wonderful that she's found a way to make a living doing what she loves." Make a living, as if Hope Harbor was barely keeping me afloat financially, rather than a successful organization with a growing budget and expanding programs. "The work must be quite challenging," Richard's business partner's wife said. "I imagine you see some difficult situations." Before I could respond, Victoria jumped in again. "Elizabeth has such a soft heart. She's always been drawn to difficult cases. Even as children, she was bringing home stray animals and trying to fix things that were broken." Difficult cases, stray animals, broken things. The metaphors weren't subtle. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice pleasant, "the women who come to Hope Harbor aren't cases or projects. They're individuals with unique circumstances who need specific support systems. Most of them are incredibly resourceful and motivated. They just need access to opportunities." Victoria's smile grew a little sharper. "Of course, dear, I didn't mean to oversimplify. I'm sure it's very complex work." The way she said complex suggested she thought it was anything but. That's when my phone buzzed, a text from Alexander. "Just landed, traffic is terrible, but I should be there within the hour. How's it going with the family?" I typed back quickly. "About as expected. Can't wait for you to get here." Victoria noticed me on my phone, and her expression cooled further. "I hope that's not work calling. Surely the homeless can manage without you for one afternoon." The comment was delivered with a laugh, as if she were making a joke, but the edge was unmistakable. Great Uncle Harold's eyebrows rose even higher, and Jennifer looked genuinely shocked. "Did she just exclude you from family photos?" "It's fine," I said, though it wasn't. Victoria is very focused on having everything perfect for her special day. But Great Uncle Harold was having none of it. "In my day," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "family meant family, period." I appreciated his indignation, but I was too tired to be surprised anymore. This was just Victoria being Victoria, the sister who'd perfected the art of making exclusion look like logistics and cruelty look like consideration. What she didn't know was that in less than an hour, her perfect day was about to be interrupted by the arrival of someone who saw my work not as embarrassing, but as extraordinary. Someone whose presence would force everyone in this room to reconsider exactly who was the successful sister in the Anderson family. After Victoria's departure, the conversation at table 15 had shifted to uncomfortable murmurs about family dynamics, but I found myself strangely calm. Maybe it was the text from Alexander, or maybe I had finally reached that point where my family's behavior was so predictably disappointing that it had lost its power to truly hurt me. Instead, I sat back in my chair and allowed myself a small smile as I thought about what none of them knew. 6 months ago, I'd been working late at Hope Harbor, reviewing applications for our new job training program, when Alexander Whittemore walked through our doors. Not announced, not scheduled, just a man in jeans and a simple button-down shirt asking if he could speak with whoever ran the organization. I'd assumed he was another volunteer applicant or maybe someone looking for services for a family member. It happened regularly. People would hear about our work through word of mouth and stock by to learn more. So when I'd introduced myself as the executive director, I'd been prepared for the usual conversation about our programs and impact.
What I hadn't been prepared for was his first question. How do you measure dignity? I paused, looking at the stranger who'd asked something I'd never heard in 2 years of donor meetings, grant applications, or site visits from foundation representatives. Everyone wanted to know about success rates, cost per participant, employment outcomes, housing retention statistics. No one had ever asked about dignity. I'm sorry, I said, genuinely confused.
Dignity, he'd repeated, settling into the uncomfortable folding chair across from my desk like he had all the time in the world. You could house every homeless woman in the county, get them all jobs, provide comprehensive services, and still strip them of dignity in the process. So how do you make sure that doesn't happen here? For the next 2 hours, we talked about participant choice in programming, about the difference between charity and empowerment, about why our intake process started with asking women what they wanted rather than telling them what they needed. He'd asked about our policy of requiring participants to contribute something to the program, whether through volunteering, mentoring, or small financial contributions, because research showed that reciprocity was crucial to maintaining self-worth. Alexander had listened with an intensity that was both flattering and slightly unnerving. He'd taken notes, asked follow-up questions, and demonstrated understanding of complex social service concepts that most people, including my own family, had never bothered to learn. When he'd finally introduced himself properly, I'd nearly fallen out of my chair. I should have mentioned, he'd said, pulling a business card from his wallet, I'm Alexander Whitmore. I run Whitmore Technologies, and I've been looking for organizations to partner with through our corporate giving program. Alexander Whitmore, the tech entrepreneur whose company had revolutionized cybersecurity for healthcare systems, the man whose personal net worth had been estimated by Forbes at somewhere north of $2 billion, the philanthropist whose name was on children's hospitals and university research centers across 3 states. And he was sitting in my cramped office in downtown Millfield asking me about dignity. I've read about Hope Harbor, he'd continued. Your outcomes data is impressive, but what brought me here was an article in the Millfield Herald about your job training program. The woman they interviewed said something that stuck with me. She said you were the first person who'd ever asked her what she wanted to do, not just what she was qualified for. That woman had been Maria Santos, a former Hope Harbor participant who'd gone on to start her own house cleaning business. The Herald had done a feature story about successful program graduates, and Maria had been generous with her praise for our approach. Most programs tell you what you're going to do, Maria had told the reporter. Elizabeth asked me what I dreamed of doing. When I said I wanted to run my own business, she didn't laugh or tell me to be realistic. She helped me figure out how to make it happen. Alexander had read that article and driven 40 minutes from his office in downtown Westbridge to ask me about dignity. Over the following weeks, he'd become a regular presence at Hope Harbor, not as a donor writing checks from a distance, but as someone genuinely interested in understanding the work. He'd attended our monthly graduate breakfast, where successful participants came back to share their experiences with current residents. He'd sat in on job training sessions, observing how we taught interview skills and workplace expectations. He'd even help serve dinner during our weekly community meal, where participants, graduates, volunteers, and neighbors shared food and conversation. The other women had loved him immediately, not because of his wealth, most of them had no idea who he was, but because of his genuine curiosity about their stories and his complete lack of judgment about their circumstances. I'd watched him have hour-long conversations with women about their children, their goals, their fears about the future. He'd remembered names, asked follow-up questions about job interviews of apartment searches, and celebrated every small victory like it mattered deeply to him. He's good people, Carmen Rodriguez had told me, after Alexander had spent an entire evening helping her practice for a job interview at the regional medical center. You can tell when someone really sees you, not what you used to be or what you might become, but who you are right now. That man sees people. Carmen was right. Alexander saw people, all people, with a clarity that was rare and precious. When he looked at the women at Hope Harbor, he saw potential and strength and worthiness.
When he looked at me, he saw someone whose work mattered, whose choices were admirable, whose dedication was attractive rather than embarrassing. We'd been dating for 3 months before I'd learned the full extent of his wealth. I'd known Whitmore Technologies was successful, but the reality of his fortune, the properties, the investments, the charitable foundations, had been overwhelming to process. "Does it bother you?" he'd asked the night he'd finally shown me the Forbes article that listed him among the country's youngest billionaires. I'd considered the question seriously. Did it bother me that the man I was falling in love with had enough money to solve most of the funding challenges that kept me awake at night? That he could write a check for Hope Harbor's entire annual budget without affecting his lifestyle in any meaningful way? "What bothers me," I'd finally said, "is that you felt like you had to hide it." "I didn't want you to see dollar signs when you looked at me," he'd admitted. "I wanted you to see Alex, the guy who thinks what you do is incredible and who's falling in love with your passion for changing the world." That's when I'd known for certain that my family was wrong about everything. Success wasn't about accumulating wealth or impressing people with expensive things. Success was about finding someone who saw your heart, who shared your values, who made you better while celebrating who you already were.
We'd married 4 months later in a ceremony at Millfield Community Garden, surrounded by Hope Harbor graduates, Alexander's closest friends, and a handful of community partners who'd become family. Maria Santos had done the catering through her new business. Carmen Rodriguez had done my flowers, using skills she'd learned in our horticulture training program. The entire evening had been a celebration of community, purpose, and authentic joy. I'd kept my maiden name professionally because Elizabeth Anderson was the name associated with Hope Harbor's work and reputation. But legally, officially, in the quiet moments when it was just us, I was Elizabeth Whitmore, wife to a man who thought my choice to leave corporate finance for nonprofit work was the most impressive thing he'd ever heard. My family had no idea, not because I was ashamed, but because their constant criticism of my career and life choices had taught me to protect the things I valued most from their judgment. I'd learned to keep my victories small and my happiness private because sharing good news with people who'd preferred when you were struggling was an exercise in futility. But today, with Victoria's passive-aggressive comments and my mother's continued embarrassment about my work, I realized I was done protecting them from the truth. I was done making myself smaller to make them more comfortable. I was done pretending that their narrow definition of success was the only one that mattered. In 30 minutes, Alexander would walk through the doors of Grandview Country Club, and my family was going to learn exactly how wrong they'd been about my poor life choices. They were going to discover that while they'd been measuring my worth by their limited standards, I'd been building a life of purpose, impact, and yes, even wealth that exceeded their wildest dreams. The irony was delicious. Victoria, who'd spent years pitying me for choosing people over profit, was about to meet my husband, a man whose profits had made it possible for him to choose people too. The wedding ceremony itself was everything Victoria had dreamed of. Elegant, expensive, and flawlessly executed. From my seat in the back row, far from the family section where my parents sat with the Thorntons, I watched my sister glide down the aisle in her designer gown while a string quartet played Pachelbel's canon. The photographer captured every moment from multiple angles, ensuring that Victoria's perfect day would be preserved in magazine-worthy images. Richard looked genuinely happy as he watched his bride approach, and I found myself hoping that beneath all the pageantry and social positioning, they actually loved each other. Despite everything between Victoria and me, I wanted her to be happy. I just wished her happiness didn't seem to require my diminishment. The ceremony was mercifully brief, a traditional Protestant service with readings about love and commitment that felt somewhat ironic given how little love my family had shown for my life choices. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the assembled guests erupted in polite applause, and Victoria's radiant smile could have powered the entire country club. As the newlyweds processed back down the aisle, Victoria's eyes found mine in the crowd. For just a moment, her expression softened, and she looked like the sister I'd grown up with, rather than the stranger who'd spent the last 2 years treating me like an embarrassment. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by her public smile as she acknowledged the congratulations of more important guests. The cocktail hour was where things began to deteriorate rapidly. While the wedding party took photos in the country club's rose garden, the rest of us were invited to the main ballroom for drinks and appetizers. The space was transformed with crystal chandeliers, white linens, and centerpieces that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with champagne and canapes, and the conversations buzzed with the particular energy of wealthy people enjoying an expensive party. I found myself gravitating toward a corner near the windows, nursing a glass of champagne and checking my phone for updates from Alexander. His latest text read, 20 minutes out. Traffic finally moving. How's the family treating you? I typed back, as expected, looking forward to seeing you. Elizabeth! A voice behind me made me turn. It was my cousin Madison, Victoria's maid of honor, approaching with two of the other bridesmaids. Madison had always been one of my favorite relatives, funny, down-to-earth, and generally kind. But the women with her were strangers, clearly Victoria's more recent social acquisitions. "Elizabeth, you look beautiful," I said, genuinely happy to see a friendly face. "Thank you. This dress cost more than my car, but Victoria insisted we all coordinate perfectly," she laughed, then gestured to her companions. "These are Victoria's friends from the country club, Priscilla Hartwell and Constance Blackwell. Ladies, this is Elizabeth, Victoria's sister." The introductions were polite but cool. Priscilla, a blonde woman whose jewelry could have funded a small nonprofit, looked me up and down with practiced assessment. "Oh yes, Victoria has mentioned you. You work in social services?" "I run a nonprofit, Hope Harbor. We provide housing and job training for women transitioning out of homelessness." Constance, a brunette with a perfectly styled bob and shoes that probably cost more than most people's monthly groceries, tilted her head with the kind of sympathetic expression people reserve for discussing terminal illnesses. "How meaningful," she said. "That must be very emotionally draining work. I don't know how you do it."
Actually, it's incredibly rewarding, I replied. The women we work with are some of the strongest, most resilient people I've ever met. Watching them rebuild their lives and achieve their goals is inspiring. "But surely it's dangerous," Priscilla asked. "I mean, working with those types of people." Those types of people. The casual dehumanization was breathtaking. "The only danger," I said, keeping my voice level, "is the risk of having your assumptions challenged by getting to know people as individuals rather than stereotypes." Madison shot me a warning look, clearly sensing tension, but I was past caring about keeping the peace. Constance laughed uncomfortably. "Well, I'm sure it's very noble work, though I have to admit, I prefer volunteering for causes that are a bit more uplifting. I'm on the board of the Children's Museum, much more pleasant than dealing with addiction and mental illness and all those complicated issues." "Homelessness isn't a character flaw," I said, "and the vast majority of our participants don't struggle with addiction or mental illness. They struggle with housing costs that have outpaced wages, with job markets that favor people with college degrees and stable addresses, with childcare systems that make it nearly impossible for single mothers to work full-time. These are policy problems, not personal failings." The silence that followed was thick with discomfort. Priscilla and Constance exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared opinion that I was being inappropriately intense for a wedding reception. "Well," Priscilla said finally, "I suppose someone has to do that work. It's just not something I could ever imagine choosing when there are so many other opportunities available." Other opportunities. Like what? Like spending their days planning charity galas that raised money for causes they'd never personally engage with? Like volunteering for organizations that let them feel good about themselves without ever having to confront real poverty or systemic injustice? Before I could respond, Victoria appeared at our little circle, having finished with the photo session. She looked absolutely radiant, her dress still pristine despite an hour of outdoor photography, her makeup perfectly refreshed. "Ladies, are you getting to know my sister?" she asked, sliding her arm through mine in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt possessive. "We were just discussing Elizabeth's work. So interesting to meet someone who's dedicated their life to helping people." The pause before helping people made it sound like a euphemism for something distasteful.
Victoria's laugh was like silver bells. Elizabeth has always been our family activist. We used to joke that she'd end up joining the Peace Corps or running away to work with Mother Teresa. I suppose this is close enough. The comparison to Mother Teresa might have sounded complimentary to an outside observer, but I heard the subtext. My work was naive idealism, a phase I should have outgrown by now. Though I have to admit, I continued. I worry about her sometimes. This kind of work is so consuming, and it doesn't exactly leave time for other priorities. Other priorities, like husband hunting, she meant, like focusing on the things that really mattered in her world: marriage to a successful man, a house in the right neighborhood, children who would attend the right schools. Actually, I said, unable to resist a small smile, I've managed to balance my work with a very fulfilling personal life. Victoria's expression sharpened slightly. Oh, are you seeing someone? You haven't mentioned anyone. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria knew I hadn't brought a date to the wedding, had assumed I was still single, still struggling to find a man who could overlook my poor career choices. I am, actually. Someone wonderful. How exciting! Madison jumped in, clearly relieved to move the conversation towards safer territory. What does he do? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed. Alexander. Pulling up now. Where should I find you? My heart rate quickened. After months of keeping our marriage a secret, after years of enduring my family's pity and condescension, the moment of truth was finally arriving. He's in technology, I said, typing back quickly. Main ballroom. Can't wait to see you. Technology, Victoria repeated, and I could practically see her mental calculation. Tech could mean anything from a well-paid software engineer to a startup founder to a support desk technician. In her world, the details mattered enormously. That's nice, Priscilla said politely. Local company? He has offices in several cities, I replied, which was technically true. Whitmore Technologies had headquarters in Westbridge and satellite offices in 6 other states. Well, I'm sure he's lovely, Victoria said, her tone suggesting she thought no such thing. It's too bad he couldn't make it today. I would have loved to meet him. Actually, I said, watching through the ballroom's floor-to-ceiling windows as a black Mercedes pulled up to the valet stand, he's here now. Victoria followed my gaze, and I watched her expression shift from polite interest to confusion to something approaching panic as she registered the expensive car and the way the valet attendants were suddenly standing straighter. That's your boyfriend? She asked, her voice climbing an octave. Through the windows, I could see Alexander stepping out of the Mercedes, looking devastatingly handsome in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Even from a distance, his presence commanded attention. The way he moved with quiet confidence, the way the valet attendants seemed to recognize him, the way other guests were beginning to notice his arrival. That's my husband, I said quietly, just loud enough for our little circle to hear. The champagne flute slipped from Victoria's hand, shattering against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire ballroom.
The shattered champagne glass drew immediate attention from nearby guests, but Victoria barely seemed to notice the crystal fragments at her feet, or the waiter who rushed over with a towel. Her eyes remained fixed on the windows, watching as Alexander handed his keys to the valet with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to luxury service. "Your husband?" Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper, but the shock in it carried clearly to our small circle. 6 months now, I said, unable to keep a small smile from creeping across my face. We had a quiet ceremony. Madison's eyebrows shot up. "Elizabeth, you got married and didn't tell anyone? Why didn't you—" "Because," I interrupted gently, "we wanted something simple and meaningful. Just close friends and people who understood what our relationship was really about." The implication hung in the air like smoke. People who understood.
unlike family, who'd spent years dismissing my choices and questioning my judgment. Priscilla was practically pressed against the window now, trying to get a better look at Alexander as he approached the country club's entrance. Is that Alexander Whitmore? She asked, her voice climbing to an almost comical pitch. The question hit the group like a physical blow. Constance actually took a step backward, her perfectly composed expression cracking. Madison's mouth fell open. Victoria looked like she might need to sit down. You know Alexander? I asked Priscilla, though her reaction had already answered the question. Know him? Priscilla's laugh was shaky. Elizabeth, Alexander Whitmore he's, God. He donated an entire wing to Children's Hospital last year. His name is on the building. I was at the dedication ceremony. He's worth, Forbes said, she trailed off, apparently unable to finish the sentence about Alexander's net worth in front of his wife. Victoria had gone completely pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Elizabeth, she said slowly, are you telling me that you married Alexander Whitmore? The Alexander Whitmore? I married Alexander, a man who believes in the work I do, who thinks my choice to leave corporate finance for nonprofit work was admirable, and who sees strength and dignity in the women we serve at Hope Harbor. But how did you even meet him? Constance asked, her voice faint. You run a small... She couldn't seem to finish the sentence. How does someone who runs a small nonprofit for homeless women end up married to a billionaire? The cognitive dissonance was clearly overwhelming her worldview. He came to Hope Harbor 6 months ago, I explained. He'd read about our work and wanted to learn more about our programs. We spent hours talking about dignity-centered service delivery and evidence-based solutions out of homelessness. He was genuinely interested in understanding the complexities of the issues we address. Each word seemed to hit Victoria like a physical blow. I could practically see her mental recalculations happening in real time. For 2 years, she'd positioned herself as the successful sister, the one who'd made the smart choices, who'd married well and built the kind of life that mattered. The Thornton family was prestigious in their circle. Richard's medical practice was thriving. Their house in Rosewood Estates was impressive. Their social connections were enviable. But Alexander Whitmore was in a completely different league. Alexander Whitmore was the kind of wealth and influence that the Thorntons could only dream of accessing. Alexander Whitmore was the man whose charitable foundation had more money than most small cities' annual budgets. He supports your work? Madison asked, still trying to process this information. He does more than support it. He understands it. He spent weeks at Hope Harbor, getting to know our participants, learning about our programs, asking questions about systemic causes of homelessness and evidence-based solutions. He didn't just write a check and walk away. He engaged. Through the windows, I could see Alexander in conversation with the country club's manager, who was clearly recognizing him and treating him with the deference reserved for extremely important guests. The manager was gesturing animatedly, probably apologizing for not being personally notified about Mr. Whitmore's attendance. Victoria was watching this interaction too, and I could see her starting to understand the implications. The country club manager knew who Alexander was, which meant that other people in this room would recognize him, which meant that in about 5 minutes, everyone at this wedding was going to know that the Anderson family's embarrassment was married to one of the most successful men in the state. Victoria, Priscilla said urgently, grabbing my sister's arm, do you understand what this means? Elizabeth is married to Alexander Whitmore. She's practically royalty in this state. Do you know how many charities would kill for his endorsement? How many business leaders would love 5 minutes of his time? The color was slowly returning to Victoria's face, but it was accompanied by something that looked like panic. I could practically see her mental gears grinding as she tried to figure out how to process this information, how to spin it, how to maintain her position as the family success story when I just revealed that I'd married into more wealth and influence than she'd ever dreamed of accessing. But you never said anything, she said finally, her voice small. At Christmas, at family dinners. You never mentioned what? I asked. That I'd found someone who respected my work? That I was happy? When would have been a good time to share that, Victoria? Between the comments about my little charity and the jokes about when I'd get a real job?
The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Our little circle had grown completely silent. The weight of years of family dynamics suddenly laid bare. I I didn't know, Victoria said weakly. You didn't ask, I replied. None of you asked. You were all so convinced that my choices were wrong, that my life was small and disappointing, that you never bothered to actually learn what my life looked like. Constance was still staring through the windows, watching Alexander's approach. Oh my God, she breathed. He's coming this way. Alexander Whitmore is walking into this wedding reception. The realization seemed to hit everyone simultaneously. In moments, Alexander would walk through those doors, and everyone in this room, everyone who'd spent the evening treating me like the family embarrassment, was going to have to confront the reality that I'd been living a life they couldn't have imagined. Victoria's expression was cycling through emotions too quickly to track: shock, confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been fear. Because if I was married to Alexander Whitmore, then everything she'd said about my poor choices, my failed life, my need to find something more substantial, was about to be exposed as not just wrong, but spectacularly, publicly wrong. How do I? Victoria started, then stopped, apparently unable to formulate a complete question. You act like the sister I've always been, I said quietly. The one whose work you've never bothered to understand, whose choices you've never respected, whose happiness you've never celebrated. Except now, you'll have to do it in front of a room full of people who will very much want to understand why the Anderson family has been treating Alexander Whitmore's wife like an embarrassment. Madison was looking between Victoria and me with growing understanding. "Oh, Victoria," she said softly, "what have you done?" But there was no time for Victoria to answer, because at that moment, the ballroom doors opened and Alexander Whitmore walked into my sister's wedding reception. The change in the room's energy was immediate and electric. Conversations faltered as people began to recognize him. The country club manager hurried alongside him, clearly wanting to escort such an important guest personally. And Alexander, oblivious to the social earthquake his presence was causing, scanned the room with one purpose: finding his wife. When his eyes found mine across the crowded ballroom, his face lit up with the kind of genuine joy that no amount of money could buy. He began making his way toward me, and I could feel every eye in the room tracking his movement, could hear the whispered conversation starting as people realized who was walking among them. Victoria stood frozen beside me, still processing the magnitude of her miscalculation, still trying to figure out how the sister she'd spent years pitying had somehow ended up married to a man whose presence could transform an entire social event. But it was too late for Victoria to prepare, too late to strategize, too late to figure out how to spin this development. Alexander was here, the truth was about to be revealed, and my family was about to learn exactly how wrong they'd been about everything. Alexander was halfway across the ballroom when my mother appeared as if materialized from thin air, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. Patricia Anderson had clearly been watching the scene unfold from across the room, had seen the shattered champagne glass, had witnessed the heated conversation, and had drawn her own conclusions about what was happening. "Elizabeth," she said in a low, urgent voice, positioning herself between me and Alexander's approaching figure. "What is going on here? Victoria looks like she's seen a ghost, and people are starting to stare." Before I could answer, Victoria grabbed my mother's arm with trembling fingers. "Mom," she whispered, "Elizabeth is married to Alexander Whitmore." My mother's expression went completely blank, as if Victoria had just spoken in a foreign language. "Alexander who?" "Whitmore," Priscilla interjected, her voice still pitched high with excitement. "The billionaire, the tech mogul. He donated the new wing at Children's Hospital. He's probably the wealthiest man in the state." The color drained from my mother's face so rapidly I thought she might faint.
Her grip on her small clutch purse tightened until her knuckles went white and she swayed slightly on her feet. That's impossible, she said finally. Elizabeth works at a homeless shelter. She drives a Honda Civic. She lives at a converted loft. She can't be married to someone successful? I asked quietly. My mother's head snapped toward me, and for the first time all day, she really looked at me. Not through me, not past me, but directly at me, as if she were seeing a stranger wearing her daughter's face. Elizabeth, she said, her voice taking on the sharp, commanding tone she'd used when I was a child caught misbehaving. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is your sister's wedding day. This is not the time for whatever this is. This isn't a game, Mom, I said. Alexander is my husband. We've been married for 6 months. Impossible, she repeated, but her voice was weaker now, less certain. Because even as she said it, she could see Alexander getting closer, could see the way other guests were recognizing him, could see the country club manager practically genuflecting as he escorted this unexpected VIP guest. That's when my father appeared, drawn by the obvious crisis unfolding in his family's corner of the ballroom. Robert Anderson looked between his wife's pale face, Victoria's panicked expression, and me standing calmly in the center of what was clearly becoming a social catastrophe.
"What's happening here?" he demanded in the voice he'd used to run board meetings for 30 years. "Elizabeth claims she's married to Alexander Whitmore," my mother said, the words coming out like an accusation. My father's reaction was different from the women's shock. His face went through a rapid calculation, surprise, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like anger. "Elizabeth," he said in a low voice, "I don't know what you think you're accomplishing here, but making up stories about being married to prominent businessmen is not going to help your situation." My situation. As if my life were a problem that needed solving, rather than a choice I'd made deliberately. "I'm not making anything up," I said steadily. "Alexander and I met through my work at Hope Harbor. We've been together for 8 months, married for 6. We live in his house on Lakewood Drive when we're in town, though we also keep my loft because it's convenient to the office." The address hit my father like a physical blow. Lakewood Drive was where the most expensive homes in the county were located, waterfront properties that sold for millions, the kind of addresses that appeared in the society pages when they changed hands. "You live on Lakewood Drive?" Victoria asked faintly. "When we're not traveling," I confirmed. "Alexander has business interests in several cities, and I've been consulting with nonprofits in other regions about replicating Hope Harbor's model." Each detail I shared seemed to hit my family like individual hammers. Not only was I married to someone wealthy, but I was living a life of success and influence that they'd never even suspected existed. My mother was gripping my father's arm now, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Robert, do something. People are watching. If this gets out, if people think if they realize how we've been treating—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. If people realized that the Anderson family had spent years treating Alexander Whitmore's wife like an embarrassment, like a family disappointment, like someone whose choices were naive and unsustainable, the social consequences would be devastating. "Elizabeth," my father said, his voice taking on the tone he'd used for difficult negotiations, "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding here. Perhaps you should introduce us to your friend so we can clear this up." Friend. Even faced with evidence, he couldn't bring himself to say husband. "There's no misunderstanding," I said steadily. "But you're right about one thing. It's time for introductions." That's when Victoria stepped forward, her face flushed with something between panic and anger. "Elizabeth, stop," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Just stop this right now." The commanding tone surprised me. This wasn't the panicked bride who'd dropped her champagne glass. This was the Victoria who'd spent years perfecting the art of social control, who'd learned to manage situations and people to maintain her carefully constructed image. "Stop what?" I asked. "This, whatever this is," she gestured wildly, at the approaching figure of Alexander, at the growing cluster of curious guests, at the obvious social earthquake happening in real time. "Today is my wedding day, my day, and I will not have you upstaging me with some elaborate story about being married to a billionaire." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. In Victoria's mind, this had to be some kind of performance, some desperate attempt to steal attention on her special day. Because the alternative? That I actually was married to Alexander Whitmore? That my supposedly failed life was actually more successful than hers? Was too threatening to her worldview to accept. "This isn't about you, Victoria," I said quietly. "Everything today is about me," she snapped, her carefully maintained bridal composure finally cracking. "This is my wedding, my reception, my moment, and I will not have you ruining it with some game you're playing." The words came out louder than she'd intended, drawing attention from nearby guests who turned to stare at what was obviously becoming a family confrontation. My mother immediately moved to damage control mode. "Girls," she said sharply, "lower your voices. People are watching." But it was too late for discretion. The scene was already drawing curious stares, and Alexander was close enough now that he could clearly see something was wrong. His expression shifted from joy at seeing me to concern as he took in the tension radiating from our family cluster. "Elizabeth, I'm warning you," Victoria continued, her voice shaking with emotion. "Do not do this to me. Not today. Find some other way to get attention that doesn't involve ruining my wedding." "I'm not trying to ruin anything," I said. "I'm just trying to introduce my husband to my family." "Your husband?" Victoria's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Elizabeth, look at yourself. Look at your life. Look at what you've chosen. Do you honestly expect anyone to believe that a man like Alexander Whitmore would be interested in someone who works with homeless people? Someone who drives a 12-year-old car and lives in a converted apartment above a non-profit office?" The words were designed to wound, to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy, to force me back into the role of the disappointing sister who needed to be managed and controlled. But they had the opposite effect, because as Victoria spoke, Alexander came within earshot, and I watched his expression change as he heard my sister publicly dismissing not just me, but the work we both valued, the life we'd built together, the choices that had brought us to each other.
Alexander Whitmore had faced down corporate boardrooms, had negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, had built a technology empire from nothing. But I'd never seen him look as coldly furious as he did in that moment, listening to my sister explain why someone like him could never be interested in someone like me. Victoria's voice carried across the ballroom with the kind of clarity that only comes from years of public speaking and social performance. What had started as a family whisper fight was rapidly becoming dinner theater for the entire wedding reception. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced, her voice taking on the projected quality she'd learned from years of charity event hosting. "I think there's been some confusion here that needs to be cleared up." The conversations around us died immediately. Heads turned from every corner of the ballroom as guests realized that the bride herself was making some kind of announcement. Alexander stopped in his tracks about 15 feet away, close enough to hear every word, but far enough that Victoria hadn't yet noticed his presence. I felt my stomach drop. Whatever Victoria was about to do, it was going to be public, calculated, and designed to humiliate me in front of everyone who mattered in her social circle. "My sister, Elizabeth," Victoria continued, gesturing toward me with the kind of theatrical flourish she'd perfected for charity auction presentations, "has apparently been telling people that she's married to Alexander Whitmore."
A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several guests pulled out their phones, clearly Googling the name to understand what they were witnessing. Others exchanged knowing glances. In this social circle, everyone had heard of Alexander Whitmore, even if they'd never met him personally. Now, I love my sister dearly. Victoria's voice dripped with the kind of patronizing affection that felt like acid. But I think we all need to be realistic about what's happening here. My mother had gone completely white and was making small, frantic gestures for Victoria to stop. But my sister was in full performance mode now, playing to her audience with the skill of someone who'd never met a spotlight she didn't love. Elizabeth works at a homeless shelter. She makes maybe $30,000 a year, drives a car that's older than some of the wine we're serving tonight, and lives in a converted apartment above her office. Each detail was delivered like evidence in a prosecution, building toward a conclusion that everyone in the room could surely see coming. She's dedicated her life to helping unfortunate people, Victoria said. The pause before unfortunate made it clear exactly what she thought of Hope Harbor's participants. And that's admirable in its way. But let's be honest about what that life looks like. Richard appeared at Victoria's side, clearly trying to intervene. Victoria, maybe we should... No, she cut him off, her eyes blazing with something that looked almost manic. No, this has gone on long enough. People need to understand what's really happening here. I stood frozen, watching my sister build toward what I knew was going to be a devastating public humiliation. Around us, wedding guests were pulling out phones, some clearly recording what was becoming the most dramatic wedding reception moment they'd ever witnessed. My sister, Victoria continued, her voice now carrying across the entire ballroom, has apparently become so desperate for attention, so embarrassed by her poor life choices, that she's resorted to claiming she's married to one of the wealthiest men in the state. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. At nearby tables, guests were leaning forward in their chairs, clearly riveted by the family drama unfolding before them. And I understand why she might create this fantasy. Victoria's voice took on a tone of pitying understanding that was somehow more cruel than outright mockery. When you've spent years watching your family succeed while you struggle to make ends meet, when you've chosen to work with people that society has given up on instead of building a real career, when you're facing the reality that you're 34 and alone while everyone around you is building actual lives, each word was a calculated strike, designed to strip away every shred of dignity I'd managed to maintain. Victoria was painting a picture of me as desperate, delusional, pathetic, a woman so far from success that she'd create elaborate fantasies to cope with her failures. I can see how the temptation to invent a different reality might become overwhelming. But claiming to be married to Alexander Whitmore, a man whose charitable foundation has more money than most small cities, a man who sits on boards with governors and senators, a man who could have anyone, literally anyone, he wanted? Her laugh was like breaking crystal, sharp and cutting. I mean, really, Elizabeth, if you were going to make up a husband, couldn't you have chosen someone more believable? The cruelty was breathtaking. Victoria wasn't just denying my marriage. She was systematically destroying my credibility, my dignity, and my worth as a human being in front of 150 people. She was making it clear that in her world, someone like me was so inherently unworthy that the idea of Alexander Whitmore choosing me was not just unlikely, but laughably impossible. The truth is, Victoria continued, building toward her finale, my sister has always been a dreamer, always been someone who lived in fantasies rather than dealing with reality. And I suppose when your reality is working for minimum wage with society's rejects, the temptation to escape into delusion becomes pretty strong. Society's rejects. She just called the women I worked with women who had survived abuse, poverty, and homelessness, women who were fighting every day to rebuild their lives, women who were some of the strongest, most resilient people I'd ever known. Society's rejects. And in that moment, something inside me snapped.
Victoria, I said, my voice cutting through her monologue like a blade, you need to stop talking. Right now. But she was too deep into her performance to pull back. What I need, she said, turning toward me with tears in her eyes that I knew were as calculated as everything else about this moment, is for my sister to stop embarrassing our family. What I need is for her to admit that this is all some kind of desperate cry for help and get the support she obviously needs. The tears were the masterstroke. Victoria had transformed herself from cruel antagonist to concerned sister, worried about a sibling who'd clearly lost touch with reality. She was making herself the victim of my supposed delusion, the long-suffering family member trying to help a relative who'd gone off the rails. "I'm worried about you, Elizabeth," she continued, her voice breaking with perfectly performed emotion. "This level of fantasy, this disconnect from reality, maybe it's time to consider that the stress of your work, the isolation of your lifestyle has taken a toll on your mental health." Mental health. She was now suggesting that I was not just lying, but actually delusional, that my claims about being married to Alexander were symptoms of psychological breakdown rather than simple attention-seeking. It was a masterpiece of public character assassination. In less than 5 minutes, Victoria had painted me as desperate, delusional, mentally unstable, and so inherently worthless that the idea of a successful man choosing me was literally unthinkable. The ballroom was completely silent now. Every eye was on me, waiting to see how I would respond to this devastating public evisceration. Some faces showed pity, others showed embarrassment, and a few showed the kind of satisfied cruelty that people feel when witnessing someone else's complete social destruction. My parents stood frozen beside Victoria, clearly horrified by what their daughter had just done, but equally unable to figure out how to undo it. The damage was catastrophic and public, and there was no walking it back. Victoria stood in the center of the ballroom, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face, the picture of a devoted sister pushed to desperation by a family member's psychological crisis. She'd positioned herself as the victim and me as the aggressor, the delusional sister whose fantasies had forced her to take drastic public action. And then Alexander Whitmore stepped forward into the circle of onlookers, his presence so commanding that the crowd instinctively parted to let him through. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made boardrooms full of executives fall silent. "But I believe you're talking about my wife." The effect of Alexander's words was immediate and electric. The murmur that had been building among the guests died instantly, replaced by a silence so complete you could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Every head in the ballroom turned toward the man who had just identified himself as my husband, and I watched as recognition dawned on face after face. Victoria's perfectly crafted expression of concerned sisterhood froze mid-performance. The tears that had been streaming down her cheeks seemed to pause in place as her brain struggled to process what was happening. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. Alexander moved through the crowd with the quiet confidence that had made him one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country. He wasn't hurrying, wasn't dramatic, wasn't trying to make a scene. He was simply a man walking toward his wife with the natural authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention without demanding it. "Alexander Whitmore," breathed someone near the back of the crowd, and the name rippled through the assembled guests like a wave. Phones appeared as if by magic, some people clearly Googling his image to confirm what they were seeing, others already taking photos and videos of what was clearly about to become a legendary wedding reception moment. As Alexander approached our family cluster, I could see the precise moment when Victoria fully understood what was happening. Her face went through a rapid progression of emotions: disbelief, shock, horror, and finally a kind of panic that I'd never seen from my usually composed sister. "Elizabeth," Alexander said as he reached me, his voice warm and intimate despite the crowd of onlookers. "I'm sorry I'm late. Traffic from the airport was worse than expected."
He leaned down and kissed me, not a performative gesture for the crowd, but the simple, natural kiss of a husband greeting his wife. The kind of kiss that spoke of familiarity, affection, and genuine love. When he pulled back, his hand found mine automatically, fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice said from near the edge of the crowd, "that's actually Alexander Whitmore." The confirmation came from Dr. Matthews, the country club's board president, who had clearly recognized Alexander and was now moving forward with the kind of urgent hospitality reserved for extremely important, unexpected guests. "Mr. Whitmore," Dr. Matthews said, extending his hand, "an honor to have you at Grandview. If we'd known you were attending, we would have prepared a proper welcome." Alexander shook the offered hand politely, but kept his attention focused on our family group. "Thank you, Dr. Matthews. I'm here as Elizabeth's husband, supporting her on her sister's special day." The emphasis on husband was subtle but unmistakable. Alexander wasn't just confirming our marriage, he was making it clear that he considered himself part of my family, that he was here in a supporting role for me. Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. You're really married?"
6 months yesterday, Alexander confirmed, his voice pleasant but carrying an undertone that anyone who'd ever been in a serious business negotiation would recognize. He was not a man to be trifled with. The crowd around us had grown larger, with guests abandoning their tables to witness what was clearly the most dramatic moment in Grandview Country Club history. I could see people frantically whispering to each other, sharing what they knew about Alexander Whitmore, trying to process the fact that one of the state's most prominent businessmen had just walked into this wedding reception. "I believe there was some question about Elizabeth's credibility," Alexander continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the steel underneath. "Some suggestion that her claims about our marriage were, what was the phrase, desperate fantasies?" Victoria's face went completely white. Several people in the crowd were now openly recording the confrontation, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. I didn't know," Victoria stammered. "Elizabeth never said. She never told us." "She never told you," Alexander repeated, and now his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that had made boardrooms full of executives sit up and pay attention. "In 6 months of marriage, 8 months of dating, she never mentioned meeting someone who appreciated her work, who valued her dedication to helping others, who was inspired by her choice to leave a lucrative corporate career to serve people in need." Each word was carefully chosen, precisely delivered. Alexander wasn't just defending me, he was systematically dismantling every assumption Victoria had made about my life, my choices, and my worth. "She never mentioned," he continued, "that someone had fallen in love with her passion, her intelligence, her commitment to making the world better for people who needed advocates." The questions hung in the air like accusations. Alexander wasn't raising his voice, wasn't being dramatic, but his words were cutting through Victoria's carefully constructed narrative like a surgical blade. "Mr. Whitmore," my mother interjected desperately, clearly trying to salvage something from this social catastrophe, "we had no idea. Elizabeth is very private about her personal life." Alexander turned his attention to my mother, and I watched Patricia Anderson visibly shrink under his gaze. "Mrs. Anderson," he said politely, "with all due respect, Elizabeth is private about her personal life because her family has spent years making it clear that her professional choices are a source of embarrassment to you." The accusation was delivered in the same conversational tone, but it landed like a bomb. Several people in the crowd audibly gasped, and I could see guests exchanging shocked glances. Alexander had just publicly called out my family's treatment of me, and there were 150 witnesses to hear it.
She's private, Alexander continued, because she's learned that sharing good news with people who've consistently criticized her choices is an exercise in futility. She's private because she's spent years protecting the things she values most from judgment by people who've never bothered to understand what she actually does. Victoria was crying again, but these weren't the calculated tears she'd shed during her performance. These were tears of genuine shock and humiliation as she realized that her carefully orchestrated character assassination had backfired spectacularly. The women Elizabeth works with at Hope Harbor, Alexander said, his voice taking on a warmer tone as he spoke about my work, are some of the strongest, most resilient people I've ever met. They're not society's rejects, as someone suggested. They're human beings who faced circumstances that would break most of us and who are working every day to rebuild their lives with dignity. The reference to Victoria's earlier comment was unmistakable, and I watched her face crumple as she realized that Alexander had heard everything: the cruel dismissal of my work, the attack on the women I served, the suggestion that I was mentally unstable. Elizabeth has helped over 200 women transition from homelessness to stable housing and employment, Alexander continued. She's built partnerships with major corporations, secured funding from federal agencies, and created a model that's being replicated in 4 other states. Her work has been recognized by the governor's office, featured in national publications, and is considered innovative by experts in the field. Each accomplishment he listed was a direct contradiction to Victoria's narrative of my failure and desperation. Alexander was systematically rebuilding my reputation in front of everyone who just heard it torn down. So, when I hear someone suggest that Elizabeth's life is small, unsuccessful, or embarrassing, Alexander said, his voice now carrying an edge that made several people in the crowd take a step back, I have to wonder what kind of success they're measuring against. He turned his gaze back to Victoria, who was now openly sobbing, her perfect wedding makeup running down her cheeks in black streaks. Because the woman I married, Alexander concluded, has dedicated her life to service, has built something meaningful from nothing, and has touched more lives in 2 years than most people do in a lifetime. If that's what failure looks like, I'd love to understand what success means to your family. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander had just delivered a masterclass in public vindication, systematically destroying every argument Victoria had made while elevating my work and choices to their proper level of respect and admiration. And then, as if the evening couldn't get any more surreal, the country club manager approached with obvious nervousness, clearly recognizing that he was dealing with someone whose presence could make or break the club's reputation. "Mr. Whitmore," he said carefully, "would you and Mrs. Whitmore prefer a table closer to the family section?"
The country club manager's question about seating hung in the air like a spark waiting to ignite an explosion. The implication was clear. If Alexander Whitmore was attending this wedding, he should be seated with the most important guests, not relegated to table 15 near the kitchen door. But that would mean acknowledging publicly that the Anderson family had seated one of the state's most prominent businessmen at the worst table in the room. Actually, Alexander said, with the kind of diplomatic grace that had made him successful in high-stakes negotiations, Elizabeth and I are perfectly comfortable where we are. The people at table 15 have been more welcoming than some family members. The comment was delivered with a slight smile, but every person in earshot understood the implication. Alexander Whitmore had just made it clear that my family's treatment of me had been less gracious than that of complete strangers. Dr. Matthews looked mortified. As country club president, he understood immediately that Grandview had potentially insulted one of the most important potential members they could ever hope to attract. "Mr. Whitmore, please let us arrange something more appropriate." "Thank you, but that won't be necessary," Alexander replied firmly. "Elizabeth and I are perfectly comfortable where we are. The people at table 15 have been more welcoming than some family members." The comment was delivered with a slight smile, but every person in earshot understood the implication. Alexander Whitmore had just made it clear that my family's treatment of me had been less gracious than that of complete strangers. Dr. Matthews looked mortified. As country club president, he understood immediately that Grandview had potentially insulted one of the most important potential members they could ever hope to attract. Mr. Whitmore, please let us arrange something more appropriate. Thank you, but that won't be necessary, Alexander replied firmly. Elizabeth and I will remain where she was originally seated. It will be educational to experience the evening from that perspective. Educational. The word was delivered with the kind of pointed meaning that made several board members I could see in the crowd shift uncomfortably. Alexander was making it clear that he would remember exactly how his wife had been treated. Victoria was still standing in the center of the crowd, her wedding dress wrinkled from her earlier dramatic gestures, her makeup destroyed by tears, looking like a woman who just watched her carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Richard had appeared at her side, clearly trying to provide support, but even he looked shock-shelled by the magnitude of what had just occurred. My mother stepped forward, her social training kicking in despite her obvious panic. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, extending her hand with the kind of forced graciousness that came from years of charity board meetings. "I'm Patricia Anderson, Elizabeth's mother. We're so pleased to finally meet you." Alexander shook her hand politely, but his expression remained coolly neutral. "Mrs. Anderson, I wish we were meeting under different circumstances." The comment was diplomatic enough to sound polite to casual observers, but anyone paying attention understood that he was referring to the public character assassination he'd just witnessed. "Perhaps," my mother continued, her voice taking on the bright, artificial tone she used when trying to manage difficult social situations, "we could start over, have a proper family introduction. There's clearly been some miscommunication." Miscommunication, as if Victoria's public attack on my character, mental health, and worthiness had been a simple misunderstanding rather than a calculated attempt at humiliation. "I don't think there was any miscommunication," Alexander replied evenly. "I heard quite clearly what was said about my wife, her work, and the people she serves. The communication was very clear indeed." My father, who had remained silent during the entire confrontation, finally stepped forward. Robert Anderson had spent 30 years in corporate leadership, and I could see him desperately trying to find some way to salvage this situation, to turn a devastating social catastrophe into a manageable crisis. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, extending his hand with the confident grip of a man accustomed to closing difficult deals. "Robert Anderson, I think perhaps we can chalk this up to wedding day stress and family emotions running high. You know how these events can be." But Alexander's handshake was brief, professional, and notably lacking in warmth. "I'm familiar with family events, Mr. Anderson. What I heard tonight wasn't stress or high emotions. It was a deliberate attempt to humiliate Elizabeth in front of a room full of people." The accusation hung in the air like a verdict. Alexander wasn't interested in diplomatic excuses or social face-saving. He'd witnessed my family's treatment of me, and he wasn't going to pretend it was anything other than what it was. Around us, the crowd of wedding guests was beginning to process what they'd witnessed. I could see people huddled in small groups, frantically whispering about the drama they'd just observed. Phones were out everywhere, with guests clearly texting friends and family about what was happening. Several people were still recording, recognizing that they'd witnessed something that would be talked about in this social circle for years to come. Mrs. Thornton, Richard's mother, approached our group with the kind of forced smile that comes from years of managing social crises. Mr. Whitmore, what a wonderful surprise to have you join us this evening. Richard and I have such admiration for your philanthropic work. Perhaps you'd like to join us at the family table. It was a desperate attempt at damage control, trying to smooth over the obvious social catastrophe by treating Alexander like the VIP he was. But the invitation only highlighted how badly my family had mismanaged the situation from the beginning. "That's very kind," Alexander replied. "But as I mentioned, Elizabeth and I are comfortable where we are. We prefer to sit with people who've shown us genuine courtesy." Mrs. Thornton's smile faltered as she realized that her attempt at hospitality was being politely but firmly rejected. More importantly, Alexander's comment made it clear to everyone listening that the Anderson family had failed to show basic courtesy to their own daughter. Victoria finally found her voice again, though it came out cracked and desperate. "Alexander, Mr. Whitmore, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. If I had known Elizabeth was married to you, I never would have—"
She stopped mid-sentence, apparently realizing that she was making the situation worse, because what she was really saying was that she wouldn't have publicly humiliated me if she'd known I was connected to someone important, not because what she'd said was wrong, but because it might have social consequences for her. "Miss Thornton," Alexander said, using Victoria's new married name with careful formality, "the issue isn't that you didn't know who I was. The issue is how you've been treating your sister. That treatment would be unacceptable regardless of who she married." The rebuke was gentle in tone, but devastating in content. Alexander was making it clear that Victoria's behavior was the problem, not her ignorance of my marriage. "You suggested," he continued, his voice carrying easily across the now silent ballroom, "that Elizabeth was delusional, mentally unstable, and so inherently worthless that the idea of a successful man choosing her was laughable. Those aren't words that came from ignorance about my identity. Those came from years of treating your sister as less than she is." Victoria's face crumpled completely. She was crying again, but these weren't the calculated tears from her earlier performance. These were the tears of someone who'd realized that her cruelty had been witnessed and judged by exactly the kind of person whose opinion mattered most in her social world. "I think," Richard said quietly, clearly trying to extract his new wife from an impossible situation, "perhaps we should give everyone some space to process this." But Alexander wasn't done. "Before we do that," he said, his voice taking on the kind of authority that had made him successful in boardrooms across the country, "I think there's something everyone here should understand about Elizabeth's work." The crowd, which had started to disperse slightly, immediately refocused on Alexander. When a billionaire speaks at a social event, people listen. Hope Harbor, the organization Elizabeth founded and runs, has one of the highest success rates of any transitional housing program in the region, Alexander announced. Under her leadership, they've maintained an 87% housing retention rate and a 92% employment placement rate. Those numbers are unprecedented in the field. He was speaking to the crowd now, not just to my family, making sure that everyone who'd heard Victoria's character assassination also heard the truth about my professional accomplishments. Elizabeth's model is being studied by housing authorities in 4 states and has been featured in national publications as an example of innovative, dignity-centered service delivery. She's been invited to speak at conferences, consult with other organizations, and advise policymakers on best practices. Each achievement he listed was news to my family, who'd never bothered to ask about the details of my work beyond their assumption that it was small and unsuccessful. So when I hear someone suggest that Elizabeth's career is embarrassing or unsuccessful, I have to wonder what definition of success they're using, because by any reasonable measure, what she's built
is extraordinary. The silence that followed was profound. Alexander had just publicly elevated my work to its proper level of respect and recognition, ensuring that everyone who'd witnessed Victoria's attack also understood exactly how wrong she had been about everything. The applause started slowly, with Great-Uncle Harold from Table 15. He began clapping with the kind of deliberate rhythm that demanded attention, his weathered hands creating a steady beat that cut through the silence. Within seconds, Jennifer joined him, then Richard's business partner's wife, then the elderly woman from Table 12 who'd been forgotten near the emergency exit, just like me. It spread like wildfire through the ballroom. Not the polite, obligatory applause of wedding receptions, but the kind of genuine, enthusiastic clapping when people witness something truly remarkable. Within moments, half the ballroom was clapping, and I realized they weren't just clapping for Alexander's defense of me. They were celebrating the exposure of something ugly that many of them had probably witnessed in their own families or social circles. The sound was overwhelming, echoing off the crystal chandeliers and marble floors of Grandview Country Club. Victoria stood in the center of it all, her wedding dress wrinkled and stained with tears, watching her perfect day transform into a celebration of her sister's vindication. Alexander squeezed my hand and leaned down to whisper in my ear, "Are you okay?" "I'm perfect," I whispered back, and I meant it. For the first time in years, standing in front of my family and their social circle, I felt completely, authentically myself. The applause finally died down, but the energy in the room had fundamentally shifted. Conversations resumed, but now they were about me, about Alexander, about the dramatic reversal they'd just witnessed. I could see people approaching who wanted to introduce themselves, to learn more about Hope Harbor, to connect with the woman who'd just been publicly recognized by one of the state's most successful entrepreneurs. "Elizabeth," a voice said behind me, I turned to see Dr. Sarah Chen, a physician I recognized from various charity events around the city. "I had no idea you were running Hope Harbor. I've been looking for exactly this kind of program to partner with our community health initiative. Could we schedule a meeting next week?" Before I could answer, another voice joined the conversation. "Miss Anderson, I'm David Walsh from the Community Foundation. We've been following your work for months. After tonight, I think we need to discuss a much larger grant than we originally planned." This was happening all around me. People who 5 minutes earlier had watched Victoria paint me as a delusional failure were now lining up to connect with my work, to offer support, to associate themselves with what Alexander had revealed was a genuinely successful and innovative organization.
My parents stood about 10 feet away, looking like they'd been hit by a truck. Patricia Anderson kept glancing between me and the growing circle of admirers around Alexander and me, clearly struggling to process how dramatically the evening's narrative had shifted. My father was checking his phone obsessively, probably Googling Alexander to understand the full magnitude of what they'd missed. Victoria had retreated to a corner with Richard and his parents, clearly trying to salvage what remained of her wedding reception. But every few minutes, her eyes would drift back to where Alexander and I stood, surrounded by people who wanted to hear about my work, who were interested in partnerships and funding opportunities, who were treating me like exactly what I was, a successful professional who'd built something meaningful. "Mrs. Whitmore," Dr. Matthews approached, using my married name with the kind of respect he'd probably never imagined showing me an hour earlier. "Grandview would be honored to host a Hope Harbor fundraising event. Our facilities are at your disposal." Mrs. Whitmore. The name still felt surreal, but hearing it used with such deference was a powerful reminder of how completely the evening's dynamics had shifted. Alexander watched these interactions with obvious pride, occasionally adding details about Hope Harbor's programs or introducing me to people he knew could be valuable connections. He wasn't taking credit or inserting himself into the conversations. He was simply making space for me to shine in my own expertise. "You know," he said during a brief lull in the constant stream of introductions,
This is exactly what I fell in love with, watching you talk about your work, seeing how you light up when you connect with people who share your values. This is who you are. This is who I've always been, I replied. My family just never bothered to look. As if summoned by my words, my mother appeared at my elbow. Patricia Anderson looked like she'd aged 10 years in the last hour, her perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled, her confident social demeanor replaced by something that looked almost fragile. "Elizabeth," she said quietly, could we talk privately?" I looked at Alexander, who nodded encouragingly. "I'll be right here," he said. My mother and I walked toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from the crowds and conversations. For a moment, we just stood there, the weight of years of misunderstanding hanging between us like a wall. "I owe you an apology," she said finally, her voice small and unfamiliar. "Several apologies. Many apologies." "Mom, no, let me finish." Her voice was shaking slightly. "What I saw tonight, what Victoria said, what you've accomplished that we never knew about, Elizabeth, we failed you. I failed you." The admission hung in the air between us. I'd waited years to hear something like this, some acknowledgement that their treatment of me had been wrong. But now that it was happening, I felt more sad than vindicated. "We were so focused on what success was supposed to look like," she continued, "that we completely missed what it actually looked like for you. We were so worried about what other people would think that we never bothered to understand what you were actually doing. I tried to tell you," I said gently. "Every family dinner, every phone call, I tried to share what was happening at Hope Harbor, but you'd already decided it wasn't real work, wasn't real success." She nodded, tears starting to flow. And tonight, watching that room full of successful, accomplished people treat you with the respect and admiration you deserved, Elizabeth, I realized that the only people who didn't understand your worth were your own family. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with my mother asking questions about my work that she should have asked years ago, expressing regret for assumptions she should never have made, and tentatively trying to rebuild a relationship that had been damaged by years of conditional love. When we returned to the main group, Alexander was deep in conversation with the mayor's wife about urban housing policy. He looked up as I approached, his face immediately brightening. "How did it go?" he asked. "Better than expected," I said. "I think we're going to be okay." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations, connections, and opportunities. People who'd never heard of Hope Harbor before tonight were suddenly interested in partnerships, donations, and collaborations. Several wealthy guests approached Alexander and I together, clearly recognizing us as a philanthropic power couple worth cultivating. Victoria's reception continued around us, but the energy had fundamentally shifted. The bride and groom's first dance felt subdued, the toasts were perfunctory, and much of the conversation continued to center on the dramatic revelation they'd all witnessed. As the evening wound down, Alexander and I said our goodbyes to the various people we'd met, exchanged business cards with potential partners, and accepted invitations to several upcoming events where Hope Harbor could be featured. "Ready to go home?" Alexander asked as we walked toward the valet stand. "More than ready," I said. As we waited for our car, Victoria appeared beside us. She'd changed out of her wedding dress into a simple cocktail dress, and her makeup had been repaired, but she still looked exhausted and emotionally drained. "Elizabeth," she said quietly, "I'm sorry, not because of who you married, but because of how I treated you, how we all treated you. You deserved better from your family." It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was real. And for the first time in years, Victoria was speaking to me as her sister, not as a problem to be managed or an embarrassment to be minimized. "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot."
Your work, she continued. The things Alexander said about what you've accomplished. I had no idea. I should have asked. I should have listened. I should have been proud. The conversation was brief but genuine. There would be more conversations to come, more healing to do, more relationships to rebuild. But for the first time in years, it felt possible. As our car pulled up, Alexander turned to me with the smile that had first caught my attention at Hope Harbor all those months ago. "So," he said, "how does it feel to be seen?" I thought about the question as we drove home through the quiet streets of Millfield Heights, past the converted loft where I'd started Hope Harbor, toward the life we'd built together based on shared values and mutual respect. "It feels like coming home," I said finally. And for the first time in my adult life, it really did. Because here's what I learned that night. When you choose purpose over profit, when you follow your values instead of expectations, when you build something meaningful instead of just something impressive, you don't just find success, you find people who recognize that success for what it really is. Have you ever been underestimated for choosing meaning over money? Comment 1 if you've stayed true to your values despite family pressure, and 2 if you're still finding the courage to choose purpose over profit. Because sometimes the biggest risk is living someone else's definition of success instead of your own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.